And I want to thank the Joseph Leadership Academy for putting this together. I was asked to speak on whether or not the U.S. will be ready for a post-Isaias Eritrea. And quite frankly, that may be the wrong question. The right question would be, what is the Eritrean diaspora doing? What is the Eritrean community in the United States doing to make sure that the United States is ready for a post-Isaias Eritrea? Look, Eritrea isn't unique. It has one of the worst dictatorships in the world, but it's not the only country that has faced the inevitability of regime change. And make no mistake, regime change is coming to Eritrea. Isaias is old, he's had a stroke, and his son is incompetent. He may believe that he has authority over the military now, but as soon as Isaias is dead, people are going, he loses his power, of course. And there are too many people among the military who will try to seize that power. And so even when Isaias goes, there's going to be a fight in order to ensure that the sovereignty and the well-being of the Eritrean people isn't stolen again, as it was stolen in 1991 and 1993. So when we look at the United States, too often the United States reacts rather than acts proactively. And when we look at the Trump administration now, they're reacting to events, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Russia, whether it's in Congo and Rwanda, whether it's in India or Pakistan. I don't think that for the last 30 years, whether under a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, we have had a coherent policy anywhere in the world, let alone towards Eritrea itself. So the question I have again is, what are you going to do to make sure that the United States is ready? This conference is a very good start, but remember how little Americans actually know about Eritrea. One of the downsides about our lack of effective diplomatic relations, of the decreased level through the decades of our relations. Yes? Okay. One of the drawbacks is that we have too few diplomats who have real experience and expertise in Eritrea. And the same is true for Americans in Congress. And remember, you may look at the congressman, but the people on the House Foreign Affairs Committee or in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who have the real power, who tell the congressman what to say, are the staffers, many of whom are just in their 20s or 30s, and they have precious little experience in Eritrea. I doubt any of them have actually been to Eritrea. So what are you doing to actually inform them? Now, it's not enough, and the worst thing you can do is simply say, the human rights situation in Eritrea is atrocious, and we need help. Because that doesn't help anyone in Washington understand what they can do. The most effective thing the Eritrean community can do is go into congressional staff and go into the State Department with an actual plan, not an aspiration, not saying what you want, that you want the Americans to support democracy. But what you need to do is say, the Eritrean diaspora is speaking with a single voice. We may represent different political groupings, but what we all agree on is that Eritrea should have a meaningful constitution, Eritrea should have a new constitutional convention, and Eritrea in the future should be a democracy. and that we will have a transition to democracy. It will be this long, and this is specifically where we need the US assistance. This is where we need European assistance. To host a constitutional convention is going to take however long, and this is the budget which it will take. We need to convince the Americans, especially during the Trump administration, which tends to want to wash its hands of problems anywhere in the world, that ensuring a smooth transition in Eritrea is an American interest. Why is Eritrea important to the United States? Again, I hate to say this, outside the Eritrean American community, how many American officials can place Eritrea on the map? And therefore, what you need to explain to everyone is there can be no peace in Yemen, no freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, no solution to instability in the Horn of Africa until and unless Eritrea is stable, secure, democratic, and works to the benefit of the Eritrean people. There's other questions the Americans are going to want to ask. And again, remember, the American experience on situations like this are shaped by what happened in Afghanistan. It's shaped by what happened in Iraq. Under no circumstances will the Americans put troops in Eritrea. That's not what I'm saying, and it's a non-starter. It's simply never going to happen. But one of the questions the Americans will have, having lived through the transitions in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Iraq transition, of course, has been more successful than the Afghanistan transition, is how are you going to balance co-opting the current bureaucracy with the needs of, or with the desire of the diaspora to return and to contribute? And we had this debate in Iraq with so-called de-Baathification, with extricating some of those who were involved in Saddam Hussein's regime. When we look at the current regime of Isaias Afwerki, what people are never going to be allowed to participate in Eritrean government again versus what people are going to be allowed to keep their jobs? If you want a smooth transition, at some level, you need to ensure many of the current bureaucrats that they're still going to be able to feed their families, they're still going to be able to contribute. Then it's up to you to convince the Americans and others about who among the current bureaucrats, whether by name or whether by level within the bureaucracy, is a true believer who has been brainwashed by Isaias Afwerki versus those who are only trying to feed their families. Now, there may be some who don't want, some in the diaspora who don't want to work at all with those who are in the current Afwerki government. And that's not a decision for me. That's a decision for the Eritreans. It's a decision for you. I would also point out that another factor which Americans need to be educated about and which the Eritrean diaspora needs to have a strong policy on would be what happens with truth and reconciliation. First of all, how are you going to define reconciliation? And in South Africa, of course, we saw one aspect of reconciliation under Nelson Mandela. Of course, the current South African leadership hasn't upheld that. We saw an opposite approach by Robert Mugabe against the former Rhodesians. In Morocco, when we had a transition in 1999 between the former king, who often abused human rights, and the current king, there was televised truth and reconciliation, which was actually pretty successful. I happen to believe that the Rwandan model is also very good. Now, granted, the Rwandan model was based on ethnic atrocities, leading up to the 1994 anti-Tutsi genocide. But what we saw in Rwanda was the international community tried to do truth and reconciliation. I think they spent something like $8 billion and only tried 80 people. And so the Rwandans instead initiated their own grassroots truth and reconciliation process, in which they would have every village basically meet and air their grievances and confront their accusers. And some of the accusers were arrested and they were forced to serve time. And then they were released and they were reintegrated into the community. But the Rwandans did, in a matter of weeks, something like processing 150,000 people who were involved in the Hutu genocidaire regime. Whereas the international community too often simply wants to take people's money and operates at a snail pace. And they don't recognize that after more than 30 years of dictatorship, Eritrea doesn't have the time to spend a decade trying some members of the former regime. So what you need to decide now is who within the former regime leaves, who is able to stay. Now, another big issue which you're going to have to deal with is, how do you finance your new government? After all, Isaias doesn't care about the Eritrean people. He's mostly stolen Eritrea's wealth. And he relies on the remittances and the illegal tax, and extortion basically, which he imposes on people from Eritrea based on their ethnicity rather than on their current nationality. So the question I have for the bankers among you and the economists is, where have you written down your policy with regard to customs duties on the border? How are you going to trade with Djibouti? How are you going to trade with Ethiopia? How are you going to trade with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states coming into Eritrea's ports? What is your policy there? There's no reason why you can't have it in advance. If you have it in advance, more than simply being noise of just one more diaspora group that wants someone outside Eritrea to empower them, you will show that you are more serious and that you are ready to take on this challenge. And it will also reassure countries Djibouti, Ethiopia, and the Gulf states that you're ready for business. Now, of course, when we talk about the Gulf states, we also need to do some preemptive diplomacy, and that can be both the Eritrean community at large, as well as asking the State Department and asking Congress to start raising questions with Abu Dhabi, for example, about the extent to which they are supporting and underwriting the Isaias regime. Look, the Emiratis aren't stupid. They know that the Isaias regime is ending. They have their strategic interests. They may be cynical, and they may be wrong in the way that they have worked with the Isaias regime. But rather than simply bash the Emiratis or resent the Emiratis, you need to recognize that they could be your partners in the future. And the question is how to convince them that if they partner with you, they will not initially lose anything from their interests, or at least they won't lose much. Again, the time to do that is now. And if they won't listen to you directly, that's what you need to start talking to the congressman about. That's what you need to start talking to Yusuf Otaiba, the Emirati ambassador to the United States, about. And remember, he's not just an ambassador. He holds minister rank portfolio in the cabinet of the United Arab Emirates. What forensic accountants do you have in place to start to trace the money which Isaias Afwerki has stolen? Now, it's all well and good to simply demand that that money be returned. and to assume that the US intelligence community understands where all that money is. That may be too much of an assumption. Sometimes it takes leaks, like the Panama Papers, to understand how dictators and other regimes hide their money and launder their money. It's time to start reaching out not only to the US Department of the Treasury in the United States, but also to the United Kingdom, and to the Italian government, and to the Emiratis, and elsewhere, to start tracing some of this money. I mean, there is a new governor of the Lebanese Central Bank in Beirut right now. What have you done in order to identify Eritrean stolen money, which is in Lebanon? What have you done to meet with people at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank? Honestly, I don't follow the Eritrean movement on a day-to-day basis, and it's quite possible, I don't mean to be arrogant or condescending, it's quite possible that you have done this. But what I'm saying is, from an American political point of view, it's this sort of groundwork which is going to define you as something more than simply a group that wants your human rights addressed, a group that is one of 100 groups which is asking for US attention. It's the way to convince that the Americans, that you are serious and that you're a partner. We need to ask some basic questions. Why is Eritrea a strategic asset to the United States? That's something, I mean, forget morality. This is the US government. They're not always moral. How do you approach the Pentagon, which only cares about China at this point? And how do you tell them that Eritrea can really be a strategic asset to them? How are you going to work with Egypt, which is suffering billions of dollars of losses because of the Suez Canal disruptions? How are you going to work with international shipping companies to convince them that you're prepared to secure their shipments through international waters off the Red Sea coast? And the fact of the matter is, based on my experience in Afghanistan and especially in Iraq, given what I see with regard to discussions now in Syria, which you should be studying, these are the types of issues which transitional governments have to face. Now, personally, I oppose Ahmed al-Shara in Syria. I think he's still a terrorist, and I think that the United States would be foolish to provide any assistance to him. I also look at Ahmed al-Shara, and this is something which the Eritrean diaspora should look at. And when I look as an analyst at Syria, Ahmed al-Shara controls about 30% of the country. You have southern tribes around Deira, which control another 25%. The Kurds control about 40%, and then you have some of the Alawi remnants along the Mediterranean coast. And yet, Ahmed al-Shara has been able to convince people that he is in charge and that he should lead the transition. What are you going to do to replicate that strategy so that even if Eritrea's future is contested, that you will be able to convince Washington and London and Rome and Addis Ababa and Djibouti and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh that you are the ones who they should be dealing with and they should be recognizing in an interim basis? And the last point I want to make is a little bit of a warning. I've met with various Eritrean diaspora groups, and quite honestly, I will never endorse one or another because as a non-Eritrean, it's not my job. I want you all to succeed, and I want Eritrea, I see Eritrea as a partner, and Eritreans, make no mistake, deserve better. But the one issue, cautionary note, and fortunately listening to the conference this morning, you guys abide by this, you get it, is that no matter how many different Eritrean diaspora groups you have, you should never, to a non-Eritrean American audience, criticize any other group. Basically, you should be laser focused. The only problem you deal with is Isaias Afwerki. And even if some of the other groups are run by fraudsters, have no backing whatsoever, the way that you prove your worth is simply by keeping the focus on the technocratic development. And then the Americans, without being told, are going to understand that you are the real deal. And that those who are simply 10 men with an internet site are not people to be taken seriously. It's not your job to convince the Americans that other groups are bad, because then what you get is the Americans throwing up their hands and saying, we don't know. We're not going to deal with any of these groups. Let them figure it out on their own, and you lose American support. Again, there's a precedent here. When I first got to Washington in 1999, as Barana said in the introduction, look, my background's in Iranian history, and then I got involved with the Iraqis and the Kurds. There were, as you know, two main Kurdish groups. There is the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is led by Masoud Barzani, and there's the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which was led by the late Jalal Talabani. The Kurdistan representation in Washington, there were two of them. The KDP, the Barzani representation, was led by someone named Farhad Barzani, and then the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan representation was led by someone named Barham Saleh. Now, Farhad Barzani didn't really do much, but what he did was he criticized the other Kurds. Barham Saleh understood that the Americans didn't know the difference between Kurdish groups. And so he focused only on opposition to Saddam Hussein. And so people started to take Barham Saleh very seriously. Fast forward 20 years after that, and because of all the support and respect he had won in Washington, D.C., he became president of the Republic of Iraq. Now, I have no doubt that perhaps someone who is listening, part of this conference, or someone that is listening on this conference, is going to be the next president of Eritrea, or at least the president after that. But the key to that is to demonstrate, instead of brag about, your professionalism. And so you're already there. And finally, and in conclusion, the only thing I would also say is you need not just convince Congress and the State Department and the Treasury. You also need to convince ordinary Americans, or at least make them more aware. And so what I always give advice when I'm dealing with others, for example, Kurds or Afghans or what have you, Turks, is that the amount of time you spend in internet chat groups or writing for other Eritreans is wasted time. That the audience you need to convince aren't the people in this conference. The audience you need to convince are the people that have never heard of Eritrea and know nothing about the Eritrean community. Now, I know some of the Eritrean community in the Washington, D.C. area. And by living in, for example, Virginia, you have the opportunity, you have the benefit of living in a swing state, of living in a state where politicians, if you organize, are going to want to talk to you and are going to want to get your vote. My advice to Eritreans, and I say this as someone who's a Republican, is that you should never choose sides between the Republicans and the Democrats. The strongest movements in the United States are those who have support from both the Democrats and the Republicans. The states that I can think of recently who have really benefited from bipartisan support are Greece, Cyprus, and India. The only issues that Donald Trump and Joe Biden agree on is that the United States and Greece should have a strong partnership. The United States and India should have a strong partnership. You need to reach out to Democrats. You need to reach out to Republicans. You need to educate everyone rather than be drawn in and forced to choose sides. And when someone disagrees with you, what the Supreme Court, the late Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia said is, I will never criticize people. I will always criticize ideas, because some very good people hold very bad ideas. The goal isn't to punish your detractors in the United States. It's to convince them that you're right. And you have so many opportunities to do that. And so I congratulate you for Daniel Burhan for convening this conference, because I think historians will mark this conference in the same way that historians mark some of the Constitutional Convention and so forth in the United States that led to our freedom. And so I congratulate you for all the work you're doing, and let me turn the floor back over. Hello?
እንዳለሁም ነው።
Daniel, Dr. Burhane.
Look, if Daniel and Burhan are offline temporarily, I can certainly ask questions until answer questions until they get back online.
Is this to be followed by question and answer session, or I don't know how the procedure is?
Look, I mean, until they get back online, rather than have quiet time, I would say that I can answer questions until someone can contact Daniel or Bahana. Or else, who was next to go? Was that you, Mabratu? If you want to start speaking, that seems fine.
I don't know, because is Professor Mengesab around or not? Because they haven't specified that.
Then I would honestly, I would just go ahead, rather than have dead time.
Yeah.
I would second that, I think.
So I don't know if I would be allowed to share a screen without the postmaster. I'll try that.
Call them on the phone or something.
I'm trying to call them on the phone. I'll keep you guys posted.
Como guver como حيعيش انت يبال.
If not, I'd like to ask Dr. Rubin about the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia as well, because many Eritreans are confused now at the moment where to stand in terms of the relationship with Ethiopia, because is Ethiopia an enemy or a partner in positive change in Eritrea? Like we have groups that are trying to work with Abiy, and the opposition or the justice-seeking camp is divided whether to support this or not. So what's your opinion on this?
The answer whether whether Ethiopia will be a help or a hindrance. The answer to that is yes. And quite frankly, I'm as confused as everyone else. Let's put it this way. Ethiopia is always going to be your neighbor, and having good relations with Ethiopia, I would argue, is an Eritrean interest. The problem right now is twofold. First of all, when Abiy Ahmed made his agreement with Isaias, Abiy Ahmed saw himself as an equal to Isaias, whereas Isaias didn't see Abiy Ahmed, a man of a different generation, a man who didn't participate in the fight against the Derg in the same way as someone lesser. And that's exacerbated tension. At the same time, however, Abiy Ahmed isn't always consistent or stable, and has a tremendously bad habit of inciting ethnic discord in order to, as a tool of control. I do believe it's useful to establish, at the very minimum, a solid channel of communication to Abiy Ahmed, because you're going to need that communication when Isaias falls. At the same time, of course, we know what Ethiopia's interests are. They want a port. It's not Eritrea's job to give up territory to Ethiopia. But you could have a symbiotic relationship, much like Ethiopia has with Djibouti, in which you can become a channel for trade within, a channel for Ethiopian trade. But one of the concerns which you need to make clear to the US Congress is that you don't want to win your freedom only to lose it again to Ethiopian imperial desires. And that's a really real and valid concern. Hopefully, now is the time for the opposition to convince Abiy Ahmed that you can be a partner, but that in exchange, Ethiopia needs to respect Eritrean sovereignty. And I should also say, the more that you strike deals with other countries, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and so forth, the more you have those deals, the harder it will be for Ethiopia to act as